I never thought delivering a pizza would change the way I understood loneliness, or that a single unexpected sentence at a stranger's door would shift the course of my quiet, ordinary life. She was 49, recently divorced, and wore an exhaustion. I couldn't ignore it, not just the kind that settles into your bones, but the kind that seeps into your spirit. When she opened that door and softly said, "Can you stay?" I'm 49 and so tired of being alone. I didn't know what to say, but something in her eyes made me pause. I wasn't prepared for what came next. The laughter, the long conversations, the tension of unspoken feelings, and the subtle but powerful way we became a part of each other's daily rhythm. This wasn't just about one delivery, it became something deeper, something unexpected, something I'm still trying to understand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It started like any other Thursday. I was running deliveries for Rocco's, a small family-owned pizza joint tucked between a nail salon and a laundromat off Clearwater Avenue. I'd been working there a few months, just a temporary gig while I figured things out after college. Didn't go the way I'd planned. The job wasn't glamorous, but it gave me time to think, pay rent, and meet the occasional interesting character. Most deliveries were quick exchanges, polite thank yous, a rushed signature, maybe a comment about the weather. That afternoon, though, the address on my receipt caught my attention. Willow Crescent. It was one of those older neighborhoods, quiet, tree-lined. A little run-down but charming in a way that said the people there had stories. I pulled into the driveway of a cream-colored house with ivy creeping up one side and a tired porch swaying gently in the wind. There was a cracked flower pot on the steps and an unopened newspaper from yesterday. I grabbed the pizza large mushroom, and black olives and knocked. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard soft footsteps, the click of a lock, and the door opened just wide enough for me to see her face. She looked like someone who hadn't expected company in a while. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few silver strands catching the late sunlight. She had lines around her eyes, not deep ones, but the kind that come from a lot of smiling or a lot of worrying, or both. She wore a navy cardigan and faded jeans, and though her posture was upright, there was something sagging in her presence, something quietly pleading. I told her the total, and she handed me exact change. But instead of closing the door right away, she lingered, holding the box between us like a shield. Then she said it, not loud, not urgent, just ... honest. "Can you stay?" I'm 49 and so tired of being alone. There was a pause, a long one. I didn't move. I wasn't sure if she was joking or testing me, or just lonely enough to say whatever floated to the surface. The air felt thick. Then, as if realizing the weight of her words, she chuckled softly and looked down. "Sorry," she said. "That was strange. You probably think I'm nuts." But I didn't. Maybe I should have. But something about the way she said it didn't sound crazy. It sounded human. I told her I had one more delivery, and then my shift was done. Without thinking too much about it, I said I'd circle back in 20 minutes just to check in, I guess. She nodded slowly, and that was that. Her name was Elise. I didn't learn that until later. But that evening, after I dropped off my last order, I drove back to her house, not sure what I was walking into. The sun had dipped below the rooftops and porch lights were flickering on. I parked across the street, unsure if she meant what she said or if I should even knock. I sat there for a minute, engine off, watching her silhouette through the window. She was moving around slowly, probably cleaning up or putting the pizza away. Finally, I got out and approached the door again. She opened it before I could knock, almost like she'd been watching for me. No questions, no explanation. Just a quiet invitation to come inside. The living room was small but tidy, with soft, yellow lighting and framed photos along a low shelf, none of them recent, I noticed. She gestured to the couch, and I sat. She sat across from me in a worn armchair. Between us was a coffee table with a half-empty glass of wine and a small plate of crusts. The TV was on, muted, cycling through a news segment about something forgettable. I asked if she was okay. She looked at me like that was the wrong question, but she didn't say no. told me it had been 3 years since her divorce, and even longer since someone had asked her how she was really doing. She didn't go into detail, just enough to sketch the outline of a life that had gradually emptied itself out. Grown kids in other states, a job she didn't hate but didn't love, friends who had moved on or gotten busy, nights that felt longer than they used to. I didn't talk much, just listened. Every so often she'd glance at me like she was checking to see if I was still there. I was. When I finally stood to leave, she didn't ask me to stay again. But she looked disappointed, not in me, just in the way good things always seem to leave too soon. I told her I worked Thursdays and Saturdays. She smiled, a little more brightly than before. I stepped out into the night, the air cooler now, the sky deepening into navy and gray. As I drove home, I thought about her words again, not just the invitation, but the fatigue in her voice when she said she was tired of being alone. I wondered how many people carried that same weight and never said a word. I didn't know what this was yet. A conversation, a moment, maybe nothing. But I knew I'd go back. Saturday came faster than I expected. Most weeks blurred together from my orders, gas station receipts, the hum of pizza ovens, the sting of pepperoni grease in my fingers, but this time, my routine felt suspended. I caught myself checking the dispatch screen more often than necessary, hoping for an address on Willow Crescent. When her name finally popped up, Elise accepted it without hesitation. The pizza was a medium vegetarian with extra olives. I remember the details now because I was paying attention. It's not just to the order, but to everything surrounding it. The shift in my mindset surprised me. I wasn't just delivering food this time. I was returning to something unfinished, something that left a question hanging in the air. As I turned onto her street, the familiar quiet met me again. The neighborhood had a kind of calm that felt timeless, like it was always 5 minutes. Before dusk, her porch light was already on, even though it was still early afternoon, casting a soft amber glow over the chipped railings and ivy. I parked in the same spot, took the box from the passenger seat, and approached the door without hesitation. Before I could knock, it opened again, as if she'd been waiting. Her hair was down this time, falling gently around her face. She looked rested in a way that wasn't physical but emotional, like something had lightened behind her eyes. I handed her the pizza and told her I didn't have another order for an hour. I wasn't sure what I expected, but she stepped aside and opened the door wider. Inside, everything was the same soft lighting. Muted television, framed photos of her younger self with others who no longer seemed to be around. A new scent hung in the air, something warm and citrusy. She'd lit a candle on the kitchen counter. I sat on the same couch. She settled into her usual armchair. Neither of us mentioned Thursday directly, but it hovered between us, acknowledged. By the comfortable silence that followed, I watched as she opened the box, took a slice, and folded it carefully before taking a bite. I did the same. We didn't rush the food or the moment. Something about the pace felt intentional, like neither of us wanted to disturb it. She asked about my week, not in a casual way, but like she genuinely wanted to know. I told her a bit, skipping the mundane parts. She listened like she was collecting puzzle pieces. Then she talked. It's not about her ex-husband or her kids or anything that people usually treat as milestones. Instead, she talked about her garden, the tomatoes that refused to grow this year, the lavender bush that had taken over half her fence, how some mornings she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched the street without really seeing. It wasn't what she said that struck me, it was how she said it, like she was sharing secrets that were too small for most people to notice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. IT means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A few minutes in, I noticed she'd turned the TV off completely. There's no background noise, just us and the occasional creak of the house settling. It felt like a decision. I didn't realize how used I'd become to fill her noise until it was gone. The silence wrapped around us like a blanket knot, heavy, not awkward, just full. I leaned back on the couch, and for the first time in a while, I didn't feel the pressure to check my phone, to move, to fill space. I let her words guide the rhythm of the room. She had a way of making even the smallest details feel important. She told me about a bird that had nested in her gutter last spring, and how she'd watched it raise its chicks from her bedroom window. I could picture her doing it standing there in a bathrobe, one hand on the window frame, letting time stretch without rush or obligation. She asked me about my plans. I shrugged, said I wasn't sure, that I was figuring things out. She nodded like she understood, not with pity, but with familiarity. I got the sense that she too had once floated in that uncertain space between now and what's next. It made me feel less alone. After a while, she offered me another slice. I declined. Not because I wasn't hungry, but because staying longer would have felt like I was asking for more than she intended. Still, I didn't stand. Neither did she. We sat there, each holding onto our slice of calm like it might disappear if we moved too fast. The clock ticked past the hour. I told the shop I'd be back. I didn't care. I texted them that I was stuck in traffic. Elise offered me water. I followed her into the kitchen and noticed the way she moved slowly, deliberately, as though every step meant something. Her fridge had magnets from places I imagined she hadn't visited in years. A Grand Canyon souvenir, a Seattle skyline, a cracked one from Paris. I wondered who gave them to her. She handed me the glass and we stood there for a moment, neither of us retreating to the living room. Then she said something that caught me off guard. She told me she almost hadn't ordered that day, that she'd stared at the app for 10 minutes, debating whether another night of microwave leftovers was fine, but something nudged her, something small but persistent. She didn't call it fate or a sign. She wasn't that kind of person. But she said sometimes the smallest choices feel like lifelines when you're drowning in quiet. To respond, so I just nodded. And maybe that was enough. As I left that day, she walked me to the door. The air had cooled and the wind picked up, making the porch swing creak behind us. She didn't ask me to stay again, but she didn't have to. I think we both knew that this wasn't about pizza anymore. It wasn't even about company, not in the traditional sense. It was about something quieter, something more essential. A reminder that connection, however brief, still mattered. That in a world filled with noise and speed and fleeting interactions, there were still moments where time slowed and two people could exist in the same quiet space without needing to explain. Why? I drove off with the windows down, letting the wind clear my head. I didn't play music. I didn't check my messages. I let the silence follow me, the good kind, the kind that makes you feel full instead of empty. I thought about Elise, about her candle, her quiet stories, her unexpected honesty, and I realized I was already hoping she'd order again next week. The following Thursday, her name didn't appear on the delivery board. I kept glancing at the dispatch screen, refreshing it every few minutes, half expecting it to light up with her address. Each order I ran felt hollow, mechanical. Apartment complexes, office buildings, families with barking dogs and hurried hands grabbing the pizza box without eye contact. I found myself missing the pause. The quiet tension that came with Elise's doorway, the way her presence softened the moment, stretched it into something that lingered after I left. When my shift ended, I lingered in the parking lot longer than usual. The thought crossed my mind more than once: drive by, see if her porch light was on, maybe find a reason to knock. But I didn't. Something about the nature of what we had felt too delicate to chase. Saturday arrived, and I was more impatient than I wanted to admit. At exactly 12 p.m., her order finally came through. A small pizza with mushrooms and red peppers this time. I accepted the delivery before anyone else could. I told myself it was just another run, that it didn't mean anything, but I knew better. I took my time packing the order into the warming bag, double-checking everything like I was handling something fragile. Noticed the porch light wasn't on yet, but the curtains in the front window were drawn back. A small gesture, a quiet sign, she answered after one knock. This time she smiled the moment she saw me, not a forced smile, but one of recognition. She seemed lighter somehow, like seeing me restored something she didn't realize she was missing. I held out the pizza, and she stepped aside before I could say anything. I didn't ask if she wanted company. I didn't have to. She walked back into the living room, and I followed, the familiarity between us now natural. She was wearing a soft gray sweater and her hair was tied in a loose braid over one shoulder. She sat in her usual chair and tucked her legs underneath her. The room smelled like cinnamon and something warm, like apple tea or a homemade candle. Sat on the couch and looked around. A new framed photo had been added to the shelf. It looked old, black and white, a younger version of her standing next to an older woman I assumed was her mother. Her expression in the photo was vivid, vibrant, in a way I hadn't seen in real life yet. I wondered what changed between then and now. She noticed me looking and mentioned it was her favorite picture. She'd found it the other day while organizing boxes in her garage. That led her into a story about her childhood summers in upstate Vermont. Long days by the lake and late nights filled with crickets and stories around bonfires. I listened, picturing her younger, laughing more easily, carrying less. Her voice held a soft rhythm when she spoke about those memories, like she was stepping into a room she hadn't visited in years. We ate in silence for a while after that, both of us content with the simplicity. She offered me some tea, and I accepted. I followed her into the kitchen again, this time noticing more details: a calendar with scribbled notes, a small plant on the windowsill, a chipped mug that read, "Be kind to yourself," in fading script. She boiled water and asked about my family, my past, things I hadn't expected her to ask. I told her bits and pieces: how I grew up 2 towns over, how my mother used to work night shifts, how I spent most of my time alone in high school because I didn't quite fit anywhere. I didn't usually share that with customers or with anyone really. But with her, it didn't feel like I was performing. It felt like I was being seen. She handed me a mug, and we leaned against opposite counters, sipping the tea slowly. Her kitchen felt like a lived-in space, like a place where things were remembered. I asked her about the plant on the windowsill. She smiled and said she named it after her sister who passed away a decade ago. Said she never had much of a green thumb, but that one plant somehow kept growing. I didn't say anything right away. It wasn't the kind of detail you responded to with words. It's just acknowledgement. She looked at me then, not through me, but at me, and said that these visits were the only times she didn't feel like a ghost in her own house. That hit me, not because it was dramatic, but because I believed her. She had this presence that was somehow both invisible and impossible to ignore. The kind of person the world overlooks even as she holds it up in quiet ways. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and finished my tea. We returned to the living room, and I stayed longer than I probably should have. The sun dipped lower outside, casting golden light through the blinds. She told me about a book she was reading and then admitted she hadn't actually picked it up in weeks. Said she'd lost the motivation to keep going, but now maybe she'd try again. There was no defining moment that evening. No big revelation, no dramatic twist. Just time, shared and respected. When I stood to leave, she didn't ask me to stay, but her eyes held the same question she asked the first time. I told her I'd be around next week. She smiled softly and said she'd probably be hungry around the same time. As I walked back to my car, I realized I wasn't just hoping she'd order a gunai. I was counting on it, and that scared me a little. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't part of the plan. I was a guy delivering pizzas, not someone, rewriting the shape of his days around the quiet rhythms of a stranger. But Elise wasn't a stranger anymore. Whatever this was, connection, routine. Curiosity, it was real enough that I couldn't ignore it. I drove home slower than usual. That night, not because of traffic, but because I wanted the stillness to last a little longer. When I got home, I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching the dark settle over my street, thinking about the warmth of her house. The gentle way she said my name, the way her voice curved around silence like it belonged there. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but I knew without question that I'd go back again. The next time she ordered, it wasn't on a Thursday or Saturday. It was Tuesday, early evening, a time when I usually wasn't on the delivery rotation. But I'd picked up extra shifts that week because someone had called out. And when her name appeared on the screen, I froze for a moment before accepting it. A large pizza with spinach and feta. The note attached simply said, "No rush." Stared at the words longer than I needed to, the small phrase carrying more weight than it should have. It wasn't about the delivery speed. It was something else. A quiet invitation, the door slightly open, not pushed, not pulled. As I drove toward her house, the sun was still high, a warm golden light spreading across the rooftops and sidewalks. Her street looked the same, but the atmosphere around her home always felt slightly different now. Like it held its breath when I pulled up. I knocked, and again, she opened the door with that same half-smile that wasn't quite happiness, but more a mix of relief and familiarity. She looked like she'd been expecting someone, and when she saw it was me, the tension in her shoulders softened. She had on a soft flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves and simple black pants, her hair loosely gathered at the nape of her neck. There was something about her on this particular evening that felt more worn in, as if she had spent the day wrapped in solitude and was now slowly emerging from it. I handed her the pizza, and she stepped back, holding the door open the way she always did now. I didn't ask if I could come in. I didn't need to. The understanding between us had taken root, so naturally, so gradually, that it barely needed acknowledgement anymore. Inside, the house smelled like lemon and rosemary. There was a faint hum of music coming from an old radio on the kitchen counter. Something low and soft, like jazz filtered through a dream. She moved around with a kind of calm, setting the pizza down on the coffee table, offering me a drink. Without speaking, just with a look and a gesture, accepted, following her into the kitchen once again, where she poured us each a glass of cold water with a slice of cucumber in it. Small touches like that told me she was the kind of person who tried even when she didn't have to, especially when no one was looking. Back in the living room, she settled into her chair, legs tucked beneath her again, and I took my usual place on the couch. The routine was becoming sacred. She asked how work was, and I told her about a customer who tried to pay me in pennies, how the boss still insisted we accept it. She laughed, not loudly, but with a genuine sound that filled the space with ease. Then she told me about a dream she had the night before, one that lingered in the back of her mind all day. She said it was strange. She was walking through a marketplace filled with books instead of food, and every book had someone's name on the cover. She said she picked up one with my name, and it was blank inside. I didn't know what to make of that, and neither did she. But it sat between us like a metaphor we didn't know how to interpret. The pizza grew cold on the table, untouched for a long while as we drifted into conversations about places we'd never been. I told her about my failed road trip to New Mexico that ended halfway in Kansas due to a blown-out tire and bad planning. She told me about a cruise she took after her divorce that was supposed to make her feel free, but instead made her feel like a passenger in someone else's happiness. We shared those things not for pity or entertainment, but because it felt right, natural, necessary even, asked. The kind of sharing that doesn't ask for anything in return, except presence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the light in the room turned amber and soft, casting long shadows across the floor. She stood and lit a candle on the mantel, the flickering flame drawing our attention for a quiet moment. Then she turned and looked at me, and there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not sadness, not exactly, not joy either. It was more like recognition, quiet acceptance of something unspoken that had been building between us since the first night. She asked me to stay. She said she used to fear this house would never feel like a home again. That after her kids moved out and the divorce papers were signed, she would sit in the silence and feel the walls closing in. She confessed that for a while she'd kept the TV on all night just to have voices in the room, that there were mornings she didn't get out of bed, not because she was depressed exactly, but because it didn't seem to matter if she did. And then, with a tiny smile, she said lately it felt different. She didn't say why. She didn't have to. I didn't know what role I played in any of this. I wasn't her friend, not exactly, not yet. I wasn't a stranger either. I was something in between, something undefined, but real. I didn't want to overstep, didn't want to read into things that weren't meant to be read, but I knew I looked forward to these visits more than anything else in my week. I knew that she did too. She finally opened the pizza box, handed me a slice, and we ate in silence for a while, listening to the soft jazz still whispering through the house. The world outside faded. The room became its own kind of sanctuary, and the quiet between us grew heavier but more comfortable, like a blanket shared without needing to speak. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the door. There was something in her gaze that lingered longer than usual. She didn't say anything, and I didn't either. But before I stepped outside, she reached for my wrist, gently, and just held it for a moment. A pause. A thank you. Maybe something. More, then she let go and nodded. I stepped into the night, heart heavier than I expected and lighter at the same time. I didn't drive away right away. I sat in the car and stared at her porch light, now glowing softly against the darkness. I could still feel her fingers on my wrist, the warmth of her touch, the way it carried something deeper than words. I didn't know what was happening between us. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I'd be back. Oh. I knew I'd keep coming back, because somewhere between the slices of pizza and the silence, something had started that neither of us was ready to name. I returned to work the next day like nothing had changed, but something had. It lingered beneath the surface of every shift, a quiet awareness that I was now operating in two worlds. There was the routine world deliveries, receipts, small talk at the register, heat from the pizza ovens fogging the kitchen windows, and then there was the other one, the slower one, the softer one. The one where Elise's house stood like a warm, quiet corner untouched by the chaos of everything else. I couldn't explain to my coworkers why I checked the screen with more anticipation now, why I leaned in a little closer each time an order alert pinged. I couldn't explain it to myself entirely either. All I knew was that something about her had shifted the atmosphere around me, made everything else feel sharper, quieter, more meaningful. That Thursday, she didn't order. Saturday came, and still nothing. I told myself she was busy, maybe out of town, maybe just cooking for herself, but the silence pressed into me more than it should have. I found myself pacing the parking lot between runs, watching the clouds roll in across the late afternoon sky. It rained that night, and with each delivery, felt more and more like I was passing through other people's lives on autopilot. Knock, exchange, smile, receipt, move on. But hers wasn't like that. With her, I stayed. I listened. I slowed down. Now in her absence, everything else felt like background noise again. By the time a week passed with no word, I started to worry in ways I didn't expect. Not panic exactly, but a quiet kind of ache. The kind that makes you want to reach out even when you're not sure if it's your place. I didn't have her number, didn't have a reason to stop by. I only had the space she'd left open and the silence where her voice used to be. It wasn't until the following Tuesday, while sorting empty boxes at the end of my shift, that I saw her name pop up again. Simple order medium pizza with olives and onions. No note this time, no instructions, just the address. I dropped everything and claimed it. The drive to her house was different this time. I felt a buzz of nerves I hadn't felt since the first delivery. I didn't know what I was walking into. I didn't know if something had happened, or if the stillness between us had simply been her retreating. But when I pulled into the driveway, her porch light was on, and a small lamp glowed through the front window. I knocked, and after a few seconds, the door opened slowly. Elise stood there, wrapped in a pale green sweater that looked soft enough to sleep in. Her eyes looked tired, like she'd been carrying a week's worth of something heavy behind them. But when she saw me, the corners of her mouth lifted, not into a full smile, but something quieter. Something like relief. She didn't say much. At first, just took the pizza, turned, and walked inside, leaving the door open for me to follow. I stepped into the warmth of her home, the familiar scent of chamomile and wood polish settling around me like a memory. She placed the pizza on the table, but didn't open it. Instead, she sat in her armchair, pulled her legs close, and exhaled. Deeply, I sat across from her, waiting, not pushing. The silence returned between us, but it wasn't cold. It was necessary. After a few minutes, she spoke. She said the past week had been hard, that she'd gotten a letter from her oldest daughter, who now lived overseas, saying she wouldn't be able to come home for the holidays. That the silence in the house had grown louder in that time. There were mornings she'd sat at the table with her coffee and just stared at the wall for hours without realizing it. I didn't interrupt. I let her speak. I let her tell me what she hadn't said before. She said the house was never supposed to be this quiet. that when she bought it with her husband 23 years ago, it was meant to be full of sound kids, parties, music, arguments, life. Now, it was mostly footsteps and the hum of the fridge. She admitted something then, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she hadn't ordered pizza that first time out of hunger, that she'd scrolled through her contacts and almost called. A few people, but no one felt right. Then she opened the delivery app and placed the order instead, thinking maybe the knock at the door would be enough. And then I showed up, and I stayed. And that scared her more than the silence had. I sat there taking it all in, and I wanted to say something comforting, but nothing felt adequate. So I just told her I was glad she'd ordered. I looked forward to those evenings more than I wanted to admit. That I didn't know what this was between us, but that I didn't take it lightly. She nodded slowly, then stood, walked over to the window, and pulled back the curtain. Rain had started to fall again, gentle and persistent. She watched it for a while, her silhouette framed against the soft light, then turned back to me and said she didn't want to eat alone tonight. We sat down and opened the box together. The smell of melted cheese and garlic filled the room. We each took a slice and ate in silence, but it wasn't the kind of silence that needed to be filled. It was grounding, necessary, alive in its own way. At some point, she got up and turned. On the radio again, tuning it to the same soft jazz station, music wrapped around the moment like a memory in motion. I glanced over and saw her eyes closed, her body swaying gently to the rhythm, like the weight of the week had finally begun to lift. Later, as I stood to leave, she didn't walk me to the door this time. She stayed seated, pulled her sweater tighter, and looked up at me like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. I nodded, a small acknowledgement, and told her I'd see her soon. She didn't respond, but her gaze lingered until the door closed behind me. As I stepped into the cool night, I felt a shift again. Not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet turning point. Like the space between us had grown smaller without either of us needing to say why. Driving home, the streets felt emptier than usual, but not lonely. I thought about her words, about the silence she lived with, about the hope she'd placed in something as small as a knock on the door, and I realized that maybe that's how connection begins, not with declarations, it's not with plans, but with a quiet understanding that someone else is listening, that someone else stayed. The next few days passed with a subtle kind of weight. Heavy, exactly, more like walking around with a memory tucked into your coat pocket. Something you keep reaching for, even though you're not sure what you'll find when your fingers touch it. Elise stayed with me, not in the literal sense, but in the lingering spaces between routines. When I made coffee in the morning, I thought about the way she lit that single candle before we sat down. When I heard jazz faintly playing from a car passing by, I remembered her soft humming, barely audible, but rhythmic. She wasn't everywhere, but she was in all the quiet. Work remained the same, orders piling up. The familiar scent of flour and grease in the back kitchen, the endless rhythm of slice, box, repeat. But I had a different energy now, like I was going through it with a split focus. One part of me was clocked in, moving through the motions, while the other part was somewhere else entirely, thinking about a green sweater, the softness of her living room lighting, or the way her voice had cracked slightly when she talked about her daughter. I didn't try to fight it. Some people slip into your life in a way that makes you feel like they were always supposed to be there. Like they're not disrupting your routine, they're giving it shape. On Thursday, her name didn't show up. Again, but I still checked the screen every 30 minutes like it might magically appear. I caught myself composing a message in my head, something casual, something that said, "Hey, just checking in," except I had no means to send it. We weren't friends in the traditional sense. There was no phone number, no social media link, no texting thread to fall back on, just deliveries, spaced out across time and emotion. I didn't realize how much I missed the sound of her front door opening until I noticed how quiet everything else felt. That Saturday afternoon, just as the last light of day began stretching across the pavement, her order came in again. A single pizza, spinach, and garlic, thin crust.
Ow.
No special instructions, no message, just the address. My heart lifted in a way that felt ridiculous, but I didn't care. I snatched the order and told the kitchen I'd take this one. They didn't ask why. Maybe they already knew not to. The drive felt familiar, like muscle memory. I could have made the turns with my eyes closed. But when I reached her house, I paused for a few seconds in the car. The porch light was on again, the same warm glow behind the curtains. Something about the routine of it made me feel steadier. I got out, walked up to the door, and knocked twice, like always. The moment she opened it, I knew something was different. You're not wrong, Dash, just ... different. She looked more rested this time, but quieter in a way that didn't feel heavy. Like someone who had made peace with something. Her hair was down, slightly curled at the ends, and she wore a navy cardigan over a simple white blouse. She didn't say anything right away, just stepped back and let me in. I followed without hesitation, feeling the now familiar rhythm settle back over us like a blanket pulled from a shelf. The pizza was placed on the coffee table, untouched again. I took my place on the couch while she curled up in her chair. She told me about a book. She finally finished a memoir about a woman who found herself after 50, traveling across the world alone and meeting strangers who changed her life in small but meaningful ways. Elise said the story made her cry, not because it was sad, but because it reminded her that change doesn't stop just because the world gets quieter. That growth isn't something reserved for youth. I told her it sounded like a good book, and she nodded, then added, "It made me think about you." I didn't ask her to. We ate a slice or two of pizza, not out of hunger, but out of habit, and then she did something unexpected. She stood, disappeared into the hallway, and returned holding a photo album. She handed it to me without a word, then sat down and waited. I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with a mix of black and white and color photographs, her as a child in the snow. Her wedding day, her daughters at different ages. Some photos were captioned, others left to speak for themselves.
Eyes.
I flipped slowly, feeling like I was being led into a room few had entered. She pointed out a few specific pictures. One, of her building a treehouse with her husband in the background. Another of her girls dressed as witches on Halloween. Her voice held a tenderness I hadn't heard before, like each memory was still close to the surface. And then, near the back, there was a photo of her sitting alone on a park bench looking off into the distance. It wasn't posed. It looked like someone had taken it without her knowing. She said her daughter took that one right after the divorce. Said she kept it because it reminded her of a truth she didn't want to forget, that she had survived. That word stuck with me. Survived. Like her life had been a storm, and now she was standing in the quiet aftermath, still breathing, still putting one foot in front of the other. I looked up at her, and she was watching me with that same expression she wore the first night, half guarded, half open, like she didn't want to hope, but was doing it anyway. I closed the album gently and said, "Thank you for sharing that." "With me?" She nodded, then looked down, brushing an invisible piece of lint from her knee. We sat in silence again, this one softer, warmer. Then she looked up and asked something simple, but it landed deep. "Do you ever feel like you're just passing through your own life?" I didn't know how to answer at first. I thought about all the years I'd spent drifting between jobs, towns, conversations, all the times I'd convinced myself that I was just a placeholder in other people's stories. I told her, yeah, I used to, but lately, not so much. She smiled at that, just a little.
Night.
And I knew she understood. As the night wore on, we didn't say much else. She walked me to the door, her hands tucked into her cardigan sleeves, and stood silently as I stepped onto the porch. Before I could turn to leave, she spoke. "You don't have to knock every time." I turned back to her, unsure of what to say. She continued, "Next time, just come in." And with that, she gently closed the door behind her. I stood on Elise's porch for a full minute after she closed the door, the echo of her words still circling in my mind. "Next time, just come in." It was such a simple sentence, but it felt monumental, unspoken shift in our rhythm. Up until now, our connection had been built in small increments, carefully measured through cautious conversation and the gentle weight of silence. But that invitation, if it could be called, that was different. It didn't just break the routine. It offered me a key to something more permanent, space that wasn't just about warmth and passing, but something settled. And I wasn't sure I knew how to handle that. The drive home that night was quiet. No radio, no distractions, just my thoughts and the low hum of tires against damp asphalt. I replayed every moment from the evening, the photo album. The way she had spoken about survival, the moment her voice trembled just enough to reveal what she usually kept hidden. She wasn't just sharing her time anymore, she was opening doors. Rooms she probably hadn't walked anyone through in years. And I knew I had to tread carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. City hummed outside my apartment window, the occasional distant siren, the hiss of tires on wet roads, muffled conversations through too thin walls. I thought about the photo of Elise on that park bench, the far-off look in her eyes. The quiet kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being unrecognized. And for a moment, I wondered how many other people I'd delivered pizzas to over the years who were also holding on by a thread, hoping the knock on the door might bring more than just dinner. The following few days moved slowly, each one pulling a little more at my attention. I completed deliveries with a kind of mechanical precision, my mind never fully in the moment. I'd find myself pausing outside homes longer than usual, wondering what stories lived behind each door. Wondering if someone like Elise sat inside, with an untouched meal and a heart full of things left unsaid. Every night, I have expected her name to show up on the delivery board again. But it didn't. Not once. And somehow, that absence felt louder than ever. By the end of the week, I gave in to something I'd resisted until then. I wrote down her address on a slip of paper and carried it with me, folded neatly in my wallet like a promise. I told myself I wouldn't show up uninvited, that I would only go if the moment called for it. But even as I said it, I knew I was just making excuses. I missed her. And not in the fleeting way you miss a familiar face. I missed her presence, her silence, her gaze that seemed to see more than she said. Saturday evening rolled around, and still no order came through. But the sky was clear, painted with shades of orange and lavender, and the kind of calm that made the city feel slower than usual. I got in my car and drove, not because of work, not because of obligation, but because I couldn't sit still any longer. Her street felt familiar now, the trees lining the sidewalk like old acquaintances. I parked down the block, unsure why, maybe out of habit or nerves. As I walked toward her house, the folded paper in my wallet felt heavier than it should have. When I reached the porch, I hesitated. My knuckles hovered over the doorframe, then lowered. Her words echoed again. Next time, just come in. But crossing that threshold without warning felt too bold, too assuming. So I did knock gently and waited. After a moment, I heard the soft padding of her footsteps inside, and then the door creaked open. She stood there, her expression unreadable. For a second, then softened into something close to surprised relief. She didn't ask why I was there, didn't scold me for showing up without an order in hand. She just stepped aside and said, "You remembered." I wasn't sure if she meant the day or her words from last time, but I nodded and stepped in. The house smelled of warm tea and faint lavender, and there was something playing softly on the record player, old soul music with a slow, steady beat. And it felt like walking into a memory I hadn't lived yet. She led me into the kitchen this time, where a kettle steamed on the stove and a small plate of sliced apples sat on the counter. She handed me a cup without asking what I wanted, chamomile and honey, warm and calming. We stood there for a while, leaning against opposite counters, sipping quietly. It struck me then how natural it all felt. Being in her space no longer required pretense or small talk, just presence. After a while, she asked if I wanted to go for a walk. It was still light outside, and the air had that crisp post-sunset chill that made your skin tighten just enough to wake you up. We walked without a destination, following sidewalks that curved past quiet homes and children's bicycles left in yards. She talked about how she used to walk this route with her youngest daughter every evening before bedtime, how the little girl used to collect leaves and press them between pages of old books. I could see her eyes glisten as she spoke, not from sadness, but nostalgia, the kind that wraps you in both warmth and ache. We walked like that for almost an hour, sharing small stories and longer silences. When we returned to her house, The porch light had flickered on again, casting soft shadows across the steps. Before she opened the door, she paused and turned to me. There was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before certainty. She didn't say anything, just reached out and took my hand. Not tightly, not desperately, just gently enough to say, "I'm glad you came." We sat in the living room for a while longer, the music playing low and steady, the candlelight dancing. On the walls? I didn't stay the night. I didn't need to. When I left, I knew that something had changed again. We had crossed another threshold, not romantic, not yet, but something foundational. The space between us wasn't uncertain anymore. It was becoming familiar, and I knew I would come back not because I was expected to, but because I wanted to, because her silence didn't scare me. It invited me in. The days that followed didn't feel ordinary anymore. It was strange how something as simple as walking into someone's home could shift the course of your own life. My routine remained. The same deliveries stacked one after another, the hum of kitchen fans, the scent of tomato sauce and oregano clinging to my clothes, but the meaning behind those hours had changed, because now, tucked between the familiar deliveries and the streets I knew by heart, was the growing presence of Elise, her silence, her warmth, the steady hum of her life, which had started to feel like part of mine. I wasn't just looking at. The delivery schedule for her name, Annie Marai, was watching for windows of time. I found myself planning my evenings around when she might be free, not because I wanted to force something, but because I felt the absence when we didn't share that quiet space. She never reached out, never left messages, but every time I appeared, at her door, there was an understanding, a soft smile, a nod, a teacup already half filled. We didn't need to announce ourselves. We just existed in the same moment and let that be enough. One evening, after a long string of back-to-back orders, I stopped by unannounced. I brought a pizza knot from the shop, but one I made myself at home. Nothing fancy, just something simple and warm. When she opened the door, she was in the middle of folding laundry in her living room. A stack of towels sat on the coffee table, and soft classical music floated through the air like background breath. She looked surprised, but not displeased. She didn't ask questions, just stepped aside and let me in. We didn't eat right away. Instead, we folded laundry together, our hands brushing occasionally as we passed fabric back and forth. It was the kind of task that felt so mundane, yet I couldn't remember the last time I felt that grounded doing something so ordinary. She told me stories about each piece: the towel her daughter had taken to summer camp every year, the sweater her ex-husband had left behind and she never had the heart to throw away. She spoke with a fondness that wasn't quite nostalgia, not quite grief. It was something more complex: acceptance, maybe, or peace. Later that night, as we sat on the couch eating slices from the pizza I'd brought, Elise asked me about my own past. She hadn't pressed before, but tonight she leaned in a little more. I told her about the towns I'd passed through, about how I used to pack up and move whenever things got too familiar, about the jobs I held long enough to save up, then abandoned. When they started feeling like anchors, I told her I didn't really have roots anywhere. I wasn't running exactly, but I also didn't know how to stop moving. She listened without interrupting, her gaze steady and calm. It's like she was holding my words with both hands. Then she said something that surprised me. She told me I reminded her of the birds that nested on her back porch, every spring always returning, but never staying long. She said she used to envy them, the way they seemed free and untethered. But now, after so many years of silence, she found herself longing for something that stayed. Something that didn't have to fly away just because the season changed. Her words sat heavy in the air between us, not because they were sad, but because they carried truth. I didn't know how to respond right away. I looked around her living room, the bookshelf with its worn spines, the fireplace framed with old family photos, the small stack of crossword puzzles half finished on the table. This was a home built on endurance, not escape. And for the first time, I realized how much I wanted to belong somewhere like that. I didn't say all of that, just nodded and said I was tired of flying. That maybe it was time to rest somewhere for a while. She didn't smile. No. She didn't offer some poetic line of reassurance. She just reached out and gently placed her hand on mine. That single gesture said more than either of us could have. We fell into a new rhythm after that. I'd stop by 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes with food, sometimes with nothing but time. We'd walk the neighborhood, browse old shops, sit on her porch drinking tea in the fading light. We rarely talked about what we were, but we existed together in a way that didn't need definition. She told me stories from her youth about how she once wanted to be a painter, but gave it up when life got busy. I encouraged her to try again. The next time I visited, an easel stood by the window, blank, but waiting. There were days when she was quieter than usual, when her thoughts seemed far away, but I didn't push. I just stayed, offering my presence like a blanket draped over her shoulders. Sometimes we didn't speak for hours, just shared the same space. And I began to realize that this, too, was love, not the kind that demanded grand gestures or constant affirmations, but the kind that grew in silence. In shared groceries, in synchronized footsteps, in the way she handed me a mug without needing to ask how I took my tea. I knew there was a line we hadn't crossed yet, something unspoken hovering between us. But I also knew that whatever this was becoming, it was steady, it was real, and it was ours. By the time the leaves began to change, Elise's front porch had become a second home to me. The wind had started to carry that cool bite of autumn, and each evening brought a little more darkness, a little more hush to the world outside her windows. She'd switched out the light blanket on the couch for a heavier quilt and started keeping a cinnamon-scented candle lit most evenings. These were small things, details I might have overlooked in any other place, but here they mattered. Here, there were signs of someone preparing to settle in for the colder months, someone who no longer expected to face them alone. The routines we built weren't spoken aloud, but they took shape naturally. Thursdays, we cooked together, her standing at the stove, sauteing vegetables while I chopped whatever she handed me, sometimes without a word. Fridays, we watched old black and white films, the kind where no one was in a rush to speak, and silence filled more space than dialogue. Sundays, we'd sit on her back steps with coffee and watch the sky change color behind the line of trees. We didn't plan these things. It just began happening, as if our time together was beginning to write its own calendar. One Sunday morning, steam rose from her cup and fog hung low over the grass. Elise told me she'd been thinking about her daughters again. She said she often wondered what they'd think if they saw her like this now, laughing more often, taking long walks, painting late at night when she couldn't sleep. She wasn't sure if they'd understand. "They see me a certain way," she said, her voice drifting between sips. "Always the caretaker, the stable one, the one who never needed anything." She looked over at me then and added, "But I did. I do." There was no need to respond. She wasn't asking for advice, only for someone to bear witness. And so I nodded, not just to her words, but to her truth. Because I'd spent much of my life unseen too, playing the background role in other people's stories, carrying out routines, fixing what was broken, delivering what was asked. And now here we both were, two people in the quiet middle chapters of our lives, learning slowly that being needed wasn't the same as being known. One night, not long after, as we sat in the kitchen finishing a late dinner, Elise turned to me and said she had something to show me. Her tone wasn't dramatic, just calm and steady. The way someone might tell you they found something in the attic they forgot they had. She led me into the back room, one I hadn't been in before. The door creaked when she opened it, and inside was a converted garage now serving as a makeshift studio. Canvases leaned against every wall. Some were blank, others half-finished. A few were fully painted in warm, abstract strokes of deep red, forest green, and slate blue. They weren't masterpieces, but they were vivid and alive. She walked over to one and touched the edge. "I used to be afraid of what the blank ones meant," she said, "that I didn't have anything worth putting on them. Now I just think of them as waiting." I could feel the weight of that sentence, how many years she must have spent waiting to create again, waiting to feel like she could still begin something new. I stepped closer, looking at a canvas filled with sweeping strokes that seemed to carry motion, almost like wind through trees. It felt like emotion made visible. Elise told me she painted late at night now, sometimes until morning, that it helped her sleep afterward, that it helped her feel like time wasn't slipping by so quickly. I told her the work was beautiful. Not out of politeness, but because it was true. She didn't say thank you. She just turned off the light and led me back into the kitchen. The room still thick with the scent of roasted squash and rosemary. That evening ended like many others. I helped her tidy up, then reached for my coat and keys. But this time, as I stepped toward the door, she stopped me. Not with words, just a hand lightly resting on my arm. I turned to her and waited, sensing something unspoken. After a moment, she simply asked, "Will you stay a little longer tonight?" Her voice was quiet but steady. I nodded, set my keys down, and followed her back to the living room. We sat on the couch with a blanket between us, our shoulders touching the television, playing something we didn't really watch. She leaned her head against me and closed her eyes. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't about romance or any dramatic declaration. It was about comfort. It was about choosing each other, not in the loud ways, but in the quiet ones that echo louder. Over time, she fell asleep there, her breathing soft and even, and I didn't move for a long time. I just sat with her weight against me, the room dim, the candle flickering low. I wasn't sure what came next, or whether we'd ever put a name to whatever this was. But I knew one thing without question. I wasn't just passing through anymore. I was anchored, even if just for a season, and Elise, in her quiet, grounded way, had become the place where my wanderings stopped. The morning after I stayed over on Elise's couch, I woke to the scent of coffee and the soft rattle of pans in the kitchen. For a moment, I wasn't entirely sure where I was. The filtered morning light spilling through gauzy curtains, the muted jazz humming low from a speaker on the shelf, it wasn't the usual start to my day. And yet it felt so normal, so natural, like I had always woken to this rhythm and simply forgotten until now. I sat up, adjusted the blanket that had slipped off my shoulder, and followed the smell into the kitchen. Elise stood barefoot near the stove, her hair tied up loosely, still in the soft sweater she had worn the night before, flipping something in a skillet. She didn't startle when I stepped into the room. She just turned slightly, gave me a half smile, and gestured toward a mug already waiting for me on the counter. It was such a small gesture, so quiet, but it told me everything. I wasn't a guest anymore. Not really. I was something else now, something that fit into the rhythm of her mornings, her silence, her rituals. And as I sipped the hot coffee and watched her move effortlessly between tasks, I felt something settle inside me. Not excitement or infatuation, but peace. The kind of peace that sneaks in after years of running. We ate breakfast on the back porch, wrapped in sweaters and sharing a single plate of toast and eggs. The neighborhood was just beginning to stir, dogs barking distantly, car doors slamming, leaves crunching under tires. She told me about her plans for the day, organizing her closet, starting a new painting, maybe calling her eldest daughter. I nodded, listening, asking the occasional question, content to just hear her voice. When the meal was finished and the plates were cleared, I told her I had to go for work, but I'd be back that evening if she didn't mind. She didn't answer right away, just leaned over, kissed my cheek lightly, and said, "I'd like that." Driving away that morning felt different than it had every other time. It wasn't a departure, it was an intermission. And for the first time in a long while, the city around me didn't feel like a place I was passing through, but a place I was moving within. Each delivery was still part of my job. But now, there was something waiting at the end of the shift, someone who noticed when I came back, who made space for me in her day, who didn't ask for anything more than my presence as the days turned into weeks. Our connection deepened, not through declarations, but through the slow accumulation of shared life. I helped her rake the backyard, a quiet task broken only by the rustle of leaves and the occasional comment about the stubborn maple tree that shed twice as much as all the others. We made soup together on cold nights, flipping through old cookbooks for inspiration and laughing when our attempts came out too salty or too bland. She painted more often now, and sometimes she asked me to sit near her while she worked, not to model, but just to be there, grounding her as she brought color back into her world. There were moments of hesitation too, times when I saw her drift inward, her eyes scanning some invisible memory. One night, as we sat on the couch, a storm rolling softly outside, She told me about the first man who broke her heart. Not her ex-husband, but someone before him. A college boyfriend who promised her the world and left without warning. She said it shaped the way she loved after that, carefully, with caution, always waiting for the floor to give out. I listened, without interrupting, and when she finished, I didn't try to reassure her or offer some grand insight. I just reached over and held her hand. Because sometimes love is not about erasing someone's past, but about standing quietly beside it. 1. Evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, Elise asked if I ever thought about leaving again. Her voice was light, but I could feel the tension underneath. I paused, setting a dish gently into the sink before answering. I told her I used to think movement was my only form of survival, that staying in one place meant giving up, getting stuck, but now I wasn't so sure. Maybe staying wasn't the end of the road. Maybe it was a choice, just like leaving had been. And maybe this time, staying meant I had finally found something worth standing still for. She didn't say anything right away, just nodded slowly and leaned into me, resting her head against my chest. We stood like that for a long time, surrounded by the clinking of dishes and the sound of water running, as if the world had narrowed to this one small, steady point. And in that stillness, I realized that whatever came next, I wasn't afraid of it anymore. Not the uncertainty, not the quiet, not the depth of feeling that came with opening my life to someone else. I wasn't sure what we were building exactly. We hadn't labeled it. We didn't plan dates or talk about moving in. But every moment with her felt like another brick in something solid, something that might one day stand tall enough to hold us both. And that was enough for now. The fear that had once lived in my chest, the fear of being known, of needing someone, of becoming a part of someone else's world, had softened. Because with Elise, I wasn't losing myself. I was becoming more of who I was meant to be. October gave way to November with little fanfare. Suddenly, Elise's neighborhood was dotted with yellowing leaves, porch pumpkins beginning to soften. At the edges, and quiet windows glowing warmly from within. Our evenings grew shorter, both in light and in the time we needed to fall into our comfortable silence. There was something sacred about the way we moved through those days, slow and deliberate, without pressure. I never felt like I needed to entertain her, and she never felt like she needed to explain herself. Our companionship had formed its own gravity, strong enough to pull us back to each other again and again. But even in that calm, something had begun to change. It wasn't tension, exactly, but a low hum beneath the routine, like we were standing in a room slowly filling with questions neither of us had asked yet. One morning, as I stepped onto her porch with coffee and 2 breakfast sandwiches, I noticed her sitting just inside the screen door, her eyes unfocused, her hand still holding a photograph I'd never seen before. She looked up and smiled, but it was a slow smile, one that didn't quite reach all the way to her eyes. I set the food on the small table near the door and asked if she wanted to talk about it. She hesitated, then handed me the photo. It was her and her youngest daughter. Maybe 10 or 15 years ago, sitting on the floor in what looked like the same living room we'd spent our evenings in. The girl was leaning against Elise's shoulder, smiling wide, her head tilted just enough to suggest trust. Elise looked younger, then more vibrant maybe, or just less weighed down. She said they hadn't spoken in almost a year. Things had been tense for longer than that. Her daughter had wanted Elise to move to the city, to live closer, to stop being so stubborn and stuck in her old ways, as she put it. Elise didn't want to leave the home she'd built, the memories she still kept alive in its walls. She thinks I'm just hiding here, she said quietly. Maybe I am, but it's my kind of hiding. I listened, letting the photo sit gently between my fingers, and told her that I didn't see someone hiding. I saw someone healing, someone choosing stillness for the first time in years. Someone allowing herself to be seen. Elise didn't say anything at first, but I could tell the words landed. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and let out a long breath, like she'd been holding it all morning. Later that week, she asked if I'd help her decorate the house for winter. Not Christmas, she clarified with a small smile. Just winter. Candles, pine cones, soft blankets. I like to pretend it makes the cold quieter. And so we spent that Friday afternoon unpacking boxes from her attic, laying garlands. Over the mantels, setting out wooden bowls filled with dried oranges and cinnamon sticks. I'd never done anything like that before. My places had always been temporary, undecorated, just enough furniture to get by. But with her, I began to understand how comforting it could be to make a space feel like it was waiting for you. When we were finished, she stepped back, looked around, and said, "This house feels warmer than it has in years." I couldn't tell if she meant the decorations or something else entirely. Maybe both. We made tea that night and sat in front of the fireplace, a low crackle filling the space between our words. She talked about how hard it had been to let people in since her divorce. Not just romantically, but even friendships. There had been too many people who disappeared when things got quiet or complicated. She said I was the first person in a long time who didn't treat her silence like a void that needed filling. I told her it wasn't hard to be there, that I wasn't waiting for her to become anything else, that who she was now, quiet, thoughtful, layered in memory and grace, was someone I looked forward to knowing more of each day. She reached across the small space between us, not to kiss me or make some grand move, but to lay her hand over mine. We stayed that way for a long time, the tea growing cold on the table beside us, the fire glowing low, a kind of stillness that felt like a heartbeat shared between two people who finally understood one another. The next morning, Elise surprised me. She asked if I'd drive her to a nearby town to visit an old friend. It was the first time she'd suggested leaving the neighborhood, first time she seemed willing to stretch her comfort zone just a little. We packed a small bag, filled a thermos with coffee, and drove out past the city into the quieter hills. She pointed out places she used to visit when her daughters were small apple orchards, antique shops, a roadside diner with the best pancakes. She swore had never been replicated. I saw a different version of her on that drive, one more open, more fluid, her memories bubbling up with ease. Her laughter spilling out like wind chimes, stirred by an old breeze at the diner. She introduced me as her friend, but the way her hand lingered on my arm said more. Her friend's name was Marlene, a widow with a shock of white curls and the warmest smile I'd ever seen. They hugged tightly like time hadn't moved at all. Over pie and coffee, I watched them slip into an old rhythm of shared glances and inside jokes, the kind of bond that only survives when built on years of honesty. At one point, Marlene looked at Elise, then at me and said, "It's nice to see you glowing again, Elle." Elise blushed, waved her off, but I saw the truth behind her eyes. On the way home, Elise was quiet in a thoughtful way, watching the sun dip behind tree-lined hills. When we pulled into her driveway, she didn't get out right away. Instead, she turned to me and said, "I'm not afraid of the silence anymore." I nodded, not needing her to explain. I knew exactly what she meant. It was strange how quickly a new kind of normal could take root. A few months earlier, my life had been about movement, doors opening and closing, addresses blurring past like fading road signs, and deliveries timed to the second. But now, my days had softened around Elise. The corners of my life no longer felt so sharp. I still worked, still delivered pizzas to the same scattered neighborhoods, but I was no longer just passing through. With her, time didn't feel like something I was running from or racing against. Felt lived. Elise had started painting more frequently, sometimes even during the day now. Her studio, once dim and mostly unused, had transformed into a space brimming with soft music, dried paint on the floorboards, and finished canvases lined up like quiet testaments to her return to herself. One rainy afternoon, I arrived just as she was finishing a piece of portrait of a tree, half bare and half covered in brilliant autumn leaves. She stood in front of it with her hands streaked in color, her expression unreadable. When I asked her what it meant, she said she didn't know. Maybe it was about change, or loss, or maybe about holding on to whatever beauty remained as the seasons turned. I didn't press her for more. Her art was like her presence, subtle, deliberate, and full of meaning. She wasn't always ready to speak aloud. I told her I liked it, that it looked honest. She smiled faintly, as if that answer was more than enough. Our conversations had started to turn toward the future, albeit gently. She mentioned repainting the guest room. I offered to help. She joked about how I should start leaving a toothbrush at her place. I laughed, But something about the idea didn't seem all that funny, it seemed. Possible. Not because we had declared anything.
Ow.
There were still no big promises or labels between us, but we were moving forward like two people who knew they were walking the same road now, side by side, one quiet Tuesday night. While we were folding laundry, Elise brought up the holidays. She asked what I usually did for Thanksgiving, shrugged and told her that most years I just picked up extra shifts, more tips, fewer awkward conversations. She hesitated, then said, "Would you come here this year? I mean, if you're not doing anything." The vulnerability in her voice was soft, careful. I told her yes without thinking.
Out?
Not out of obligation, but because there was nowhere else I'd rather be. She spent the days leading up to Thanksgiving preparing every detail. She baked pies that made the whole house smell like cinnamon and nutmeg, made shopping lists in her sketchbook margins, and asked me to bring folding chairs up from the basement. I watched her move through her preparations with a kind of nervous energy I hadn't seen before, like she wanted everything to be just right. Even though it would only be the two of us. Maybe it was the first time she had hosted without family in years. Or maybe it was something else entirely. When the day arrived, the weather was gray and cold, but inside her home, everything felt warm and full. We ate slowly, laughing over her slightly overcooked stuffing, reminiscing about childhood traditions that neither of us had kept but still remembered fondly. She lit a candle at the center of the table and told me it was her way of making space for those who couldn't be there, her mother, her strange daughters, and the parts of herself she'd lost over the years. I added a quiet toast to that, and we clinked glasses over sweet potato mash in quiet gratitude. Later that evening, as we sat on the couch under a thick blanket, Elise pulled out an old photo album. It was worn at the edges, the kind with plastic sleeves and handwritten dates. She flipped slowly, pointing out birthdays, school recitals, forgotten vacations. Each photo carried a small story, each one more revealing than the last. I learned about her first apartment, her struggles balancing motherhood and a nursing job, her fear of public speaking that had kept her from ever running for head nurse, even when she'd been the obvious choice. These weren't confessions. They were offerings, pieces of her life she was choosing to hand over. Little by little, I found myself telling her stories too, ones I hadn't shared with anyone in years, about my dad's silence, my mom's resilience, the way I once thought becoming a delivery driver would only be temporary, and how quickly 5 years had passed. I told her I used to imagine a different kind of life for myself, one filled with purpose, with someone to come home to. I admitted that I'd let that version of myself drift away slowly, quietly, until I met her. She listened without flinching. That's what Elise did best. She didn't try to fix or redirect or mask discomfort with platitudes. She just sat with me in the truth of it. She'd become the kind of person I didn't know I needed, someone whose very presence made silence feel like safety instead of distance. That night, as we finished the last of the pie and let the fireplace burn low, Elise turned to me and said, "You know, I was afraid of getting close to someone again. I thought it would bring more grief than comfort, but now I'm starting to think maybe love doesn't always have to mean losing something." I reached over, took her hand, and said, "Sometimes it means finding the part of yourself you thought was gone." We didn't sleep on opposite ends of the couch that night. We moved slowly, wordlessly, and let the quiet between us do the talking. There was no rush, no tension, only trust. And that trust, built brick by brick in the smallest of ways, had become the foundation of something real. The first real snow came just a week after Thanksgiving. It started slowly, light flurries drifting through the afternoon sky, and by evening the roads had gone quiet under a soft, white blanket. I had finished my deliveries early that day, the pizza shop owner deciding to close a few hours ahead of schedule due to the weather. As I pulled up to Elise's driveway, I saw her at the window, wrapped in a shawl, holding a mug between both hands like she was warming herself from the inside out. The porch light was already glowing, casting a warm circle against the growing dusk. And I felt the strange pull of something that no longer felt temporary. She opened the door before I even knocked. Her smile soft, her eyes tired in a way that told me she had been thinking maybe too much. I brushed snow from my jacket as I stepped inside. She took it gently from my shoulders, hanging it on the rack near the entryway. The house smelled like cloves and roasted apples. She had lit 3 candles in the living room and laid out a thick quilt on the couch where a quiet movie was already paused, waiting. Without words, we moved toward the comfort of the space we'd shaped together, her pace, my presence, our rhythm. Later that night, the wind howled gently outside, and we lay beneath the quilt with only the flicker of firelight between us. She shifted slightly and asked something that surprised me, not because it was bold, but because it had been floating unspoken between us for weeks. She asked if I thought about the future. Not in some far-off, abstract way, but us. This. Where we were headed. What we were building. I paused, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I wanted to give it weight. I told her that I thought about it more than I admitted, even to myself. That I'd stopped trying to predict things, but that lately, I'd started hoping again. Not for a fairy tale, but for something real. Something slow and flawed and worth the work. I told her that if she wanted me there in her home, her life, I would show up every day without needing a name for it. She didn't reply right away. She just reached up, her fingers brushing my jaw, said that maybe love after a certain age wasn't about declarations or fireworks, but about choosing each other in the ordinary. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until she said that, and when I exhaled, it felt like letting go of every fear I'd carried from the years before. The next morning, Elise brought down 2 dusty boxes from the attic, marked Christmas, and asked if I'd help her decorate. We turned on an old holiday playlist, made spiked hot cocoa, and opened each box like we were rediscovering a part of her history. The ornaments were mismatched, some chipped, some faded, but each had a story: a ceramic snowman her youngest daughter made in 2nd grade, a glass bird from her grandmother's collection, a silver bell she and her ex-husband had bought during their first year of marriage. Back when things were still tender and full of promise, as we decorated the tree, I watched her face shift through a carousel of emotions: nostalgia, joy, grief, quiet pride. She wasn't hiding any of it, and I didn't need her to. We strung the lights together, careful and slow, and when we stepped back, the tree looked imperfect and beautiful. It looked lived in, like her, like us. That evening, she asked if I'd spend the night again, not on the couch this time. Not as a guest. It wasn't about anything physical, though that part of our closeness had gently started to unfold in its own way. It was about presence. It's about waking up with someone next to you in the quiet hours of the morning and not feeling alone. And so I did. I stayed. We started living together in all but name. My things were still at my place across town, but little by little, more of me began to fill her home. A toothbrush in the bathroom, a drawer in her dresser, my favorite mug beside, hers on the shelf. She never asked me to move in, and I never said I had. But we both knew that we had crossed into something deeper. We no longer counted time by days spent together, but by the few hours we were apart. One night, she stood in the doorway of the bathroom, her arms crossed, watching me brush my teeth, and she said it casually, almost playfully. "You realize? You basically live here now, right?" I laughed, mouthful of toothpaste, and nodded. Yeah, I noticed. We didn't define anything more than that. It was enough to acknowledge what we both felt. But life, as it always does, found ways to test the quiet. In early December, Elise received a call from her eldest daughter, Miriam. They hadn't spoken in almost a year, and the conversation, while civil, had left her rattled. Miriam wanted to come visit Jess for the weekend. Elise was surprised, unsure, nervous. She confided in me that she didn't know what version of herself to show: the mother who had tried her best, the woman who had retreated from her daughter's lives in order to survive her own pain, or the version of herself she was just starting to become again with me. I told her she didn't need to choose, that maybe Miriam needed to see all of her, not a performance, but the real thing. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of healing. She nodded slowly, and then said something I'll never forget. "I spent so long grieving the version of me I used to be. I never imagined I'd be building a new one in my 40s. and I certainly didn't expect you to show up with a pizza and change everything." I smiled, took her hand, and replied, "Neither did I. But here we are." Miriam arrived on a cold Friday morning just as the last of the snow had started to melt from Elise's walkway. I was already at work, having taken the early shift, so Elise could have time with her daughter alone. We hadn't discussed whether I'd return that evening, but I knew better than to assume. This was a bridge Elise had to cross on her own terms, and I respected that. Still, I couldn't help checking my phone more often than usual, waiting for a message or a sign that things were okay, that she was okay by the time my last delivery was finished. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the streets in soft twilight. I sat in my car longer than necessary, staring at the quiet screen of my phone, unsure if I should head to her place or not. Then, just as I started the engine, a message came through. Simple. 4 words. "You can come over." That was all. The permission I needed. When I pulled up, the porch light was on, and there were 2 pairs of boots by the door. I stepped inside quietly and heard the faint hum of music coming from the living room. Elise was in the kitchen, drying dishes, her hair pulled back, and a small smile rising at the edges of her lips as she saw me. She motioned silently for me to come in. Miriam sat on the couch, legs tucked under her, holding a cup of tea. It looked like her mother, only younger, with sharper features and guarded eyes. She watched me with polite curiosity, like she was still trying to figure out where I fit into the picture she hadn't seen being painted. Elise introduced me simply. "This is Cal. He's a friend." I could hear the pause, feel the weight of that unfinished truth. Miriam just nodded. Not warm, not cold, just observing. The evening unfolded slowly. They talked about old neighbors, a cousin's new baby, a friend's retirement party, all safe topics. But underneath it all, I sensed a quiet discomfort, like Elise was waiting for something to go wrong. Miriam asked a few pointed questions: how long I'd been around, what I did besides delivering pizza, whether I had family nearby. I answered honestly, but without overreaching. I wasn't there to prove anything. I was just there. Eventually, Miriam excused herself to call her husband and headed to the guest room with a tired goodnight. Elise and I remained in the kitchen, standing by the counter, not speaking for a moment. Then she leaned back against the fridge and sighed. She's still trying to figure out who I am now. I think she expected to find me stuck, not moving on. I stepped closer and brushed her hand with mine. Let her see it, all of it. You don't owe her the version of you she kept in her head. The next morning was brighter, the sun catching. In the icicles that had formed on the eaves, Elise made pancakes, and I stayed out of the way, while mother and daughter danced around each other in careful circles. At one point, Miriam asked if we could all take a walk through the old trail. Behind the neighborhood, one Elise used to walk them through as kids. We bundled up and set out together, the wind biting at our cheeks, our boots crunching over patches of frozen leaves. The walk was quiet at first. Just the rhythm of footsteps and occasional birdsong. Then somewhere near the clearing where the trees thinned out, Miriam slowed down and asked Elise if she was happy. It wasn't confrontational. It was tentative, almost fragile. Elise stopped walking. She looked at her daughter for a long time and then said, "I'm getting there. Slowly, and I'm not doing it alone." She glanced at me briefly, then back to Miriam, and that's okay. Miriam nodded. Her face didn't soften, but something behind her eyes did. Maybe acceptance. Maybe just the beginning of it. She didn't say anything more, but when we returned to the house, she helped Elise make tea without being asked. That night, the 3 of us sat in the living room and watched an old holiday movie. Elise dozed off halfway through, her head resting against my shoulder, and when I looked over at Miriam, she was watching quietly, not judging, not intervening, just watching, maybe understanding. The next morning, when Miriam packed her things to leave, she hugged Elise tighter than I expected. She didn't say much, just that she'd call soon. But when she turned to me before walking out the door, she said, "Take care of her. She's tough, but she still breaks sometimes." I nodded. My voice caught in my throat and said, "I will." It was the closest thing to approval I could hope for. I took it for what it was. After the door closed, Elise stood by the window for a long time, watching her daughter's car disappear down the road. I joined her silently and we stood there side by side, not speaking. I think she looked up at me and said, "That went better than I thought." I agreed, and we both laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was done and it hadn't fallen apart. We spent the rest of the day in comfortable stillness, cleaning up, reading by the fire, napping in turns. Something about having her past walk through the door and then leave without breaking anything gave Elise a new calm, kind of internal quiet that made her move differently. She smiled easier, sighed less, and I knew more than ever that whatever we were building had just passed an invisible test. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low again and the house glowed golden, she said, "Maybe we should take a trip. Just us. Get out of here for a while." I looked at her, surprised, and she added, "I want to see what it feels like to be somewhere else. With you?" I told her I'd go anywhere she wanted. She smiled and said, "Good. Then let's start dreaming." And for the first time in a long time, I let myself picture a future that didn't look anything like my past, but felt more like home than anything I'd ever known. We didn't decide on a destination right away. Elise kept a small notebook. On the kitchen counter, where she started scribbling idea cities she'd never visited, places she remembered fondly from childhood, scenic drives she'd once seen on travel shows. I'd come over after work and find the notebook open, a new list forming each day. "What about Asheville?" she'd ask over morning coffee. "Or have you ever driven up the Oregon coast?" On lazy Sunday afternoons, it wasn't really about where we'd go. It was about allowing ourselves to imagine something beyond the routine. We were both rebuilding. But now, instead of just constructing a sanctuary inside her home, we were daring to imagine how we might exist in the world dashed together. After a few weeks of back and forth and scribbled, notes and travel blogs bookmarked. On her tablet, we settled on something that felt just right for who we were now. A cabin rental nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains just outside of Boone, not too far, not too extravagant, but far enough from our everyday scenery to feel like a new chapter. Elise said she wanted quiet, fresh air, and maybe snow if they were lucky. Just wanted time uninterrupted, unmeasured time with her, away from all the noise of memories and routines. We packed light, taking only what we needed, leaving behind what we didn't. Elise brought her paints. I brought my journal. She packed herbal teas and books she hadn't had time to read. I brought a portable speaker and the playlist we always listened to while cooking. As we loaded the car in the early morning frost, she turned to me and said, "This doesn't feel like an escape. It feels like a return." I didn't ask her to explain. I understood. The drive itself was beautiful in a quiet, cinematic kind of way. Winding roads, towering pines dusted with snow, the world softening around us like we'd entered a dream. Neither of us wanted to wake from. We didn't talk the whole way, just small comments, a few songs, and the kind of peaceful silence that only happens when two people are completely at ease with each other. When we arrived, the cabin was everything we hoped it would, rustic but warm. A stone fireplace, a porch that overlooked a forest so dense, and still it felt like time slowed down just for us. The first night, we cooked dinner together in the tiny kitchen. Elise made a lentil stew that filled the room with the smell of thyme and garlic. I sliced sourdough while the fire crackled nearby. We ate slowly on a small wooden table by the window and watched as snow began to fall outside. It wasn't heavy, just a gentle dusting, the kind that made the world outside look hushed and distant. After dinner, we curled up on the couch. Beneath layers of blankets, sipping tea, not saying much, Elise rested her head on my chest, and I played with her fingers absent-mindedly. Both of us lost in a comfort that didn't need words. The next morning, she set up her easel near the window. Painting in the early light while I brewed coffee, I watched her from the kitchen, her hair messy from sleep, her face serene as she dragged the brush across the canvas. She was painting the trees outside, but there was something in the way she moved, so focused, so present, that made it feel like she was painting more than just the view. She was painting her place in it. Later, she said it was the first piece she'd made in years that didn't feel forced. "It just came out of me," she said quietly, like I didn't have to. Try so hard to feel something. That day we hiked a short trail Elise had found online. It led to a clearing that overlooked a frozen lake, surrounded by towering evergreens. We stood there for a long time watching our breath rise in clouds, not speaking. Mian asked if I ever thought about what would have happened if she hadn't asked me to stay that night. I told her I thought about it all the time, and that I'd probably still be delivering pizzas to strangers, passing her house without knowing who she was. She smiled and said, "I was terrified when I asked you to stay." I almost didn't say it. Told her I was terrified too. But maybe the bravest thing we ever did was admit we were lonely out loud. That night, after another home-cooked meal and a bottle of wine shared over candlelight, Elise stood up and took my hand. She didn't say anything. She just pulled me gently toward the fireplace where a quiet song was playing. We danced there, slow and close, the light from the flames flickering across her face. I rested my forehead against hers, feeling the rise and fall of her breath, the rhythm of our steps. The world outside had vanished. It was just us and the warmth we had made for ourselves. The next few days passed in a blur of contentment. Morning. Walks, midday naps, afternoons spent painting or reading, evenings by the fire. We talked more than we had in weeks, not just about us, but about the years before us. Elise told me stories of her college days, of the time she'd almost studied abroad in Paris but changed her mind last minute. I told her about the road trip I took in my 20s that ended in a broken-down van and the best month of my life. Living off the grid, we laughed, sometimes cried, but mostly we just listened to each other, not like people who were trying to impress or fix, but like people who knew how rare it was to be truly seen. On our last night at the cabin, Elise surprised me with a small painting she'd done while I was asleep one morning. It was of us, or rather of two people silhouetted in the window of a small cabin, holding each other in front of a fire. Snow was falling outside, and the light glowed warm through the panes. She'd signed the bottom corner but didn't say anything about it. Just handed it to me, waited, and when I finally looked at her with tears forming in my eyes, she simply said, "This is what it feels like to not be alone anymore." I kissed her gently, pulled her close, and whispered, "We'll keep building this. Whatever it is, one moment at a time." We returned home to a world that felt smaller, somehow not in a bad way, but in that way only distance and perspective can create. The moment we stepped through Elise's front door again, I felt the contrast. The house was exactly as we left. It's still warm, lived in, but we weren't the same people who had packed our bags just days earlier. Something between us had solidified in the mountains, crystallized like the frost that had clung to the cabin windows each morning. It wasn't just comfort or convenience anymore. It was something rooted, grounded, intentional. That first night back, we didn't unpack. We simply dropped our bags in the hallway, turned the heat up a little, and curled on the couch with takeout and leftovers. Elise rested her head on my chest while we listened to the same playlist that had accompanied our road trip. There was no need to talk about the trip just yet. We both knew the memories were still ripening inside us. Besides, silence between us had never felt like a void. It was a pause, a shared breath, space where presence lived. In the following days, we returned to our regular rhythms. I went back to my delivery route, and Elise resumed her studio sessions and weekly check-ins with her therapist. But our routines had shifted, subtly, like tectonic plates slowly realigning. I noticed she called her daughters more frequently, not long, emotional talks, but gentle, intentional conversations about books, the weather, a new recipe she wanted to try. Miriam even sent her a photo of her son painting with watercolors, saying, "Looks like someone inherited Grandma's talent." Elise beamed when she showed it to me. It wasn't reconciliation in full, but it was a soft beginning. I started spending more time at Elise's than at my own place. It had started gradually before the trip, but after coming back, I realized my apartment felt less like home and more like a place I used to live. One Saturday morning, while sipping coffee at her kitchen table, I offhandedly said I might cancel the lease when it came up in a few months. Elise didn't say much, just nodded thoughtfully. Eyes fixed on her mug butt, the corner of her mouth curved upward ever so slightly. I didn't press. It was enough to let the idea float between us. Winter deepened. The holidays came and went with quiet grace. Kept things simple. Just a small tree, a handful of ornaments, and 2 stockings by the fireplace. Elise made cider and spiced cookies. And I wrapped her gift a wool scarf I'd noticed her admiring in a shop window like it was a secret treasure. She gave me a leather-bound journal, embossed with my initials, and inside the front cover, she wrote, "For the next chapter, wherever it leads." That sentence alone stayed with me longer than anything I'd written in the journal itself. The days were shorter now, and the nights came early. Some evenings we went for walks around the neighborhood, bundled in layers, fingers entwined in thick gloves. There was a peace to it, watching the world wind down for the night, porch lights flickering on one by one, dogs barking in the distance. The occasional sound of laughter from a nearby home. One evening, as we passed by a row of houses decorated with soft white lights, Elise stopped and looked at me, her breath rising in clouds. She said, "I used to feel invisible in this town. It's like I was just someone fading into the background." I took her hand tighter and said, "You've never looked more alive to me." Her eyes glistened, and she leaned her forehead against mine. We didn't need anything more in that moment, as January arrived. I noticed a change in Elise, a retreat, but a quiet introspection. She spent more time painting, often closing the door to her studio while she worked. I never interrupted. I knew art had always been her private sanctuary, and now she was diving deeper into that world. Sometimes she'd show me a piece, ask my opinion. Other times, she'd just smile and say, "Not yet." And I respected the boundary. One evening, after a long shift and a snowstorm that made the roads nearly impassable, I finally arrived at her house. Exhausted, half-frozen, and aching from a full day behind the wheel. I opened the door and was immediately met with the soft glow of candles, the smell of rosemary and garlic in the air, and the sound of a jazz record spinning on the old player she kept near the fireplace. Elise stood in the kitchen in a thick sweater, stirring something in a pot. She turned, saw me, and smiled in that quiet way she did when words weren't necessary. I stepped out of my boots and coat, walked over, and just wrapped my arms around her from behind. We stood there like that for a long time, swaying to the music, the rhythm of the day slowing to match our breath. She said, "You're always coming back to me, no matter how the day goes. You always find your way here." I rested my chin on her shoulder and whispered, "That's because you feel like home." And I meant it, more than I'd ever meant anything. A few days later, I found myself walking through my apartment, looking at everything I had once held onto: old photos, unused kitchen gadgets, books I'd been meaning to read for years. No longer felt like my life. It felt like a chapter that had quietly closed. I called the landlord, let them know I wouldn't be renewing, and started sorting through what I would take with me and what I'd leave behind. I didn't tell Elise right away. I wanted to make sure I wasn't rushing. But every time I thought about waking up next to her, drinking coffee on that porch, hearing her laugh echo through the hallways, I knew I was moving toward something real. And so, late one Sunday morning, as we sat on the floor of her living room, organizing boxes of old decorations, I told her. She didn't speak at first, just looked at me with those deep, thoughtful eyes. Then she reached over, took my hand, and said, "Then I guess we better make room in the closet." We both laughed, and just like that, something shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly. It's just a gentle turning of the page. We were writing a new story together, and neither of us knew exactly where it would lead. But for the first time in a long time, the unknown felt less like a cliff and more like a path we were finally ready to walk. Side by side, the days began to stretch again, slowly and almost imperceptibly, until we could feel spring pulsing. Beneath the last patches of frost on Elise's lawn was in the air, and the way the sunlight began reaching through the windows at new angles, waking us up with a kind of gentle insistence. I'd officially moved in by then, not all at once, but in steady waves. First, it was a drawer, then a shelf in the bathroom, a few jackets hung beside hers, and finally, my coffee mug on the kitchen rack, sitting beside hers like it had always belonged there. Neither of us made any grand announcements or labeled it a milestone, but we both knew we were no longer building something uncertain. We're living in it now. Elise's house transformed subtly too. My presence was now fully stitched into the fabric of her space. She began to refer to the guest room as the office, which we converted into a makeshift creative corner for the both of us. Her easel still stood near the window, but now there was a small desk I brought from my apartment, where I scribbled thoughts into the journal she'd gifted me. Sometimes we worked in silence together, each consumed by our own rhythm. Other times we'd share a bottle of wine and talk about our days like we were exchanging gifts, not just reciting events. One afternoon I came home from a delivery. Shift and found her curled up on the couch, her reading glasses sliding down her nose, a manuscript open on her lap. She had been reading one of my journal entries, the one I had casually left open by mistake, not intending for her to see. My heart skipped, not out of anger, but out of sheer vulnerability.
Out!
But when she looked up, there was only tenderness in her expression. She patted the couch beside her and said, "You write like you've been watching me from the inside out." I sat beside her and nodded slowly, unable to speak, and she added, "Thank you for letting me be seen like that." We didn't talk about it further. We didn't need to. In early March, Elise hosted her small book club at the house something she hadn't done since before I entered her life. The women trickled in with wine and cookies and the familiar scent of old pages. I kept to the kitchen, giving them space, occasionally refilling teapots and offering snacks like a polite ghost. From the hallway, I could hear them laughing, really. Laughing as Elise recounted parts of our mountain trip. She didn't use my name directly, but I heard her say, "We danced by the fireplace," and the words held so much light that I had to sit down for a moment. She was sharing me not as a secret, not as something fragile, but as part of the fabric of her life. That meant more than any declaration. A few days after that, we received an invitation to a small wedding from Elise's cousin, who lived 2 towns over. Elise had mixed feelings. "I haven't seen most of these people in years," she said, brushing her hair back anxiously.
Oh.
All be asking questions, judging, wondering what happened to the version of me they knew a decade ago. I offered to stay home, to let her go alone if she preferred. But she looked at me, eyes steady, and said, "No. I want them to meet the version of me that's finally breathing again." We went together. I wore a charcoal suit that hadn't seen the light of day since before the pandemic, and Elise wore a soft blue dress that matched the sky. At the reception, she introduced me simply as Cal, and for the most part, the questions didn't come. People smiled, nodded, asked how she'd been. A few looked between us and seemed to register something deeper, something more tender than surface-level companionship. No one said anything unkind. In fact, one of her older aunts pulled her aside and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "It's good to see you glowing again." Elise smiled, her fingers brushing against mine under the table. Later that night, while we slow danced under a string of lights, Elise leaned in and whispered, "I didn't know I could feel this comfortable in my own skin again. I forgot what that felt like." I kissed her forehead and said, "That's the only version of you I've ever known." Life wasn't perfect, of course. There were still days when Elise would retreat into herself without warning, quiet and hard to reach. Sometimes I'd wake to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window with that faraway look that said the past had come knocking again. I never pushed. I'd wrap my arms around her from behind and rest my chin on her shoulder. Until she softened, until she leaned back into me and exhaled whatever weight had crept in overnight. Other times, it was me who needed anchoring when work wore me thin, or doubts about the future started to echo in the corners of my mind. We didn't fix each other. We didn't try. But we held each other, and sometimes that was more than enough. By April, the porch became our favorite place. The air warmed, the trees bloomed, and we'd sit outside with our morning coffee. Barefoot and sleepy, listening to the world wake up. Sometimes Elise would read aloud from whatever novel she was lost in, and other times I'd jot down pieces of our story, unsure where it would lead but needing to keep track of how far we'd come. It was during one of these quiet mornings that Elise turned to me and said, "You know, I don't think we're just healing anymore. I think we're actually living now." And she was right. The difference was subtle, but real. We were no longer 2 people trying to survive their own loneliness. We were something better. something whole. We had built a small, unremarkable life on the outside, but inside, it was sacred. Shared space of safety, laughter, understanding, and quiet joy. There was no fanfare, no defining moment where we crossed some invisible threshold. We had simply grown roots together, without noticing. And when the neighbor's dog barked at nothing, or the mail got delivered late, or the faucet leaked again, it didn't feel like life being messy. It felt like our life. It's unfolding imperfect, but entirely ours. It was a Tuesday morning in late April when Elise received the letter that would quietly shift the direction of our life again. She found it in the mailbox, sandwiched between a grocery flyer and a dental appointment reminder. At first glance, she thought it was junk. Just another envelope addressed in that overly neat computer font that always made things look sterile. But when she opened it in the kitchen and read the contents, her hand froze midair. I noticed her expression change the moment I walked in. She was standing by the sink, the letter trembling slightly in her fingers, eyes darting back and forth, like she was trying to make sense of it. I asked if everything was okay, and she nodded too quickly, which told me it wasn't. She passed me the paper and stepped back like she couldn't hold it a second longer. It was from the estate attorney. Of her late Aunt Anne's unexpected inheritance of a small lakeside cottage upstate, nestled on a property Elise had visited only once in her childhood. It came with a choice. She could sell it, or she could claim it, maintain it, and in doing so, preserve the land that had belonged to her mother's side of the family for generations. Elise sat down heavily, staring out the window. I didn't. Even though she remembered me in her will, she said quietly. I haven't spoken to anyone on that side in years. Over the next few days, the idea of the cottage hovered over us like a low cloud, neither threatening nor promising, just present. Elise didn't rush into any decisions. She walked more, painted less, spent long hours on the porch with a blanket over her lap and a cup of cooling tea at her side. I gave her space but stayed close, knowing this wasn't just about a piece of property. It was about lineage, memory, and the complicated tether that ties us to our past, whether we ask for it or not. Then one night, as we were getting ready for bed, she looked at me and asked, "Would you come with me, just to see it? I can't decide anything until I know what it even feels like to stand there." I agreed immediately, not because I had any great attachment to the idea of a cottage, but because I knew how important this moment was for her. This was a thread reaching back through time, offering her a chance not just to remember, but to reclaim. We left early on a Saturday morning, the drive long but quiet. The roads were flanked by trees just beginning to blush with spring color, and the air grew cleaner the farther we got from the city. When we finally pulled up to the cottage, it was like stepping into a forgotten photograph. The house was small, a little weather-worn, the paint faded. The shutters uneven, but there was a stillness around it that felt sacred. Elise stepped out of the car slowly, her breath catching as she looked at the wild grass curling around the stone steps, the ivy reclaiming one side of the porch. "It's smaller than I remember," she said softly, then added, "but it still feels like it remembers me." Inside, the air smelled like dust and old pine. The furniture was covered in sheets, the windows cloudy with time. But everything felt strangely intact, like the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting. Elise moved through the rooms with the reverence of someone walking through memory, touching walls, pausing at a chipped wooden table near the back window. She said, "I think this is where I sat with her the last time we visited." And in that moment, I saw her not as she was now, but as a small girl clinging to the edges of memory. Finally brave enough to step back inside them, we stayed the night, sleeping on an old mattress that creaked under our weight, wrapped in borrowed blankets from the car. That night, under the unfamiliar ceiling of a house from another time, Elise curled into me and whispered, "I don't know what to do with this. But part of me wonders if this place could be a beginning, not just a relic." I held her close and told her we didn't need answers right now, only permission to imagine. The drive back from the cottage was quieter than the drive up. Elise sat with her knees pulled slightly toward her chest, staring out the passenger side window with the kind of contemplative silence that didn't ask to be interrupted. I didn't fill the air with chatter. Let the trees speak for us, their leaves rustling in the late spring wind like they carried secrets we weren't quite ready to hear. Back at home, everything looked smaller, again cozier, a little more finite. The cottage had stirred something in Elise, and now the walls of her familiar home felt like a question waiting to be answered over the next week. The cottage became a frequent thread in our conversations. At first it was small things. Whether the plumbing still worked, how far the nearest grocery store was, if the roof could survive another winter. Then it turned into something deeper. Elise asked if I could ever imagine leaving the city behind, trading street noise and sidewalk grit for crickets and misty mornings on the lake. I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't know, but because I understood what she was really asking. Could I imagine uprooting the life we had grown together here? Delicate, imperfect, but safe, and try to replant it somewhere unknown? Evening, she brought out a blank canvas and began painting not a scene, but a feeling. As the strokes filled in, I saw a cabin wrapped in forest shadows, a dock reaching out toward a silver lake. She didn't name it, but we both knew what it was. She didn't ask me for a decision, and I didn't give one. We simply sat side by side, two people standing at the edge of a possibility, letting it whisper to us softly through paint and silence. Spring melted into early summer, and with it came a softness that neither Elise nor I could quite name. We didn't rush any decisions about the cottage. It remained there in the back of our minds, like an unopened letter waiting on the corner of a desk. Some days, Elise would mention it in passing, wonder aloud how the wildflowers looked this time of year, or whether the hummingbirds had returned to the porch feeder her aunt used to hang. Other days, she said nothing about it at all, and we simply lived. Coffee in the mornings, walks through the neighborhood, late dinners, while vinyl spun softly behind our laughter. But slowly, subtly, the rhythm of our days began shifting. In dramatic ways, but like the turning of a tide, steadily, silently, undeniably. We started sorting through things not as an act of departure, but of clarity. Elise began going through her studio supplies, deciding what could be donated, what she wanted to keep, what she'd take if we left. I found myself doing the same, with old tools and books I hadn't touched in years. It wasn't about packing. It was about deciding what mattered now, in this version of our lives. And in those small acts of letting go, something became clear. Neither of us was afraid of change anymore. We were just learning how to shape it in a way that felt like us. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch watching the clouds move slowly above us, Elise reached over and took my hand. She said she'd made a decision. It's not a final, irreversible one, but a choice nonetheless. She wanted to spend the summer at the cottage. It's not to move yet, not to uproot everything, just to be there for a while, to see what life might feel like in that space, to paint, to breathe, to listen. I want to find out if that place can hold the weight of who I am now, she said. I nodded, the answer already blooming in my chest before I even spoke. Then let's go, I said. Let's see what's waiting. So we packed.
Not everything.
Just the essentials. Clothes, brushes, journals, old records, spices from the kitchen we couldn't live without. We left the rest as it was, a home waiting patiently for our return. The morning we drove away, Elise stood on the front step for a long time, her eyes lingering on the house she'd built her life in. "This place saved me once," she whispered, "and now it's letting me go." I didn't say anything. I just placed my hand gently at the small of her back, and together we stepped forward. The cottage greeted us like an old friend, weathered and a little broken, but still full of warmth. Over the next few weeks, we settled into it slowly. Elise painted every morning with the windows open, the sound of the lake lapping just beyond the trees, repaired small things around the house, loose shutters, a crooked doorframe, the steps to the dock that had softened with time. We cooked together with fresh herbs we grew on the porch, read aloud to each other in the evenings, and sometimes sat in silence as the sun dipped behind the pines. It wasn't a vacation. It was a quiet rehearsal for a life we hadn't fully committed to yet, but one we were beginning to believe in. Neighbors from down the road came by one afternoon with a pie and soft smiles, curious but kind. They didn't ask too many questions, just welcomed us, told us stories about the area, and offered help if we ever needed it. It felt different from the city, slower, more intimate, less about being seen and more about being known. Elise bloomed. In that slowness, her laughter came easier. Her silences were less heavy. And I realized something. It wasn't the cottage that mattered. It was what it allowed her to remember, that she wasn't trapped by her past, or by age, or by grief. That life still had wide open doors. By mid-July, we had created a routine that felt like breathing. One evening, as we sat by the lake watching fireflies flicker over the water, Elise leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "I used to think being alone meant I was broken, that I'd done something wrong. But now, even when I'm by myself, in the studio or reading while you're out running errands, I don't feel lonely. I feel ... full." I held her hand tighter. "It's because you're not alone anymore. You're just ... whole." She didn't reply. She didn't have to. The quiet between us was thick with meaning. As the season edged toward August, we knew we had to decide whether to go back, whether to stay. One morning, over toast and coffee on the deck, Elise said, "I don't want to live in between anymore. I want roots. I want this to be home." And just like that, the decision was made not with a bang, but with a whisper. A truth that had been growing inside both of us, finally spoken. We returned to the city one last time to collect the rest of our belongings, to say goodbye to the house that had carried us this far. We donated what we didn't need, handed off the keys to a young couple just starting out, and left with only what truly mattered. As we drove back to the cottage with the last boxes in the trunk, Elise rested her hand on my knee and said, "Thank you for delivering that pizza." We both laughed, the kind of laugh that holds the weight of 1,000 quiet moments behind it. We never told the full story to anyone. Not really. Some parts were too delicate, too personal, too sacred. But we lived it, every page. And now, each morning, as the sun spills across the lake and the floorboards creak beneath our steps, we are reminded that love isn't always loud or sudden. Sometimes it's a gentle knock at the door, a quiet invitation, a woman saying, "Can you stay?" and a man choosing to say yes. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.